Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Isle of Arran Distillers Sunday Club. Now, some of the more beady-eyed of you Arran Sunday Club regulars may have already noticed that I am not your usual host, Mariella Romano. Disappointing, I know. I lament that very fact often myself. However, today you have me, Andy Bell, from Isle of Arran Distillers, and today we're doing a slightly different edition of the Arran Sunday Club, in that today we are looking at the Lagg Sunday Club. Now, what we're going to do at the new Lagg distillery in the south of Arran, something that we've started over the past couple of years, is we're going to be really lifting the lid off peat as a subject. We're going to be digging a little bit deeper into the topic of peat, and that is precisely what we intend to do for you today. So to that end, I've asked some of my friends to come along and join us and help me do that. So we're going to have a nice discussion around the table, and my friends that I'm bringing in today, James Wills from Kilhoman, over on Islay, a very famous distillery for being a farm distillery and doing every part of the process from growing the barley to putting that lovely whiskey in a bottle. So James will have a really good scope of knowledge for us to share with peated Islay whiskies in mind. I've also got Scott Adamson, my friend from the Tomatin Distillery, going to be coming on and talking about the Cwtbochen range of whiskies. Now, a fascinating expression that they make up there, all about experimenting with unusual styles and making headway into, making the category of peated whiskey a little bit more wide in its flavours. And we're also going to bring in Lagg Cask Society and White Stag member Andrew Smith. He works and is proprietor of Little Brown Dog Spirits up in Aberdeenshire. So he should be able to shed a bit of light from another more consumer type angle to the whole peated whiskey discussion. So without further ado, let's bring the guys in.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, lads. Nice to see you all. You all well?
Yeah, good.
This is where we do the bit that we sort of pretend that we've not been chatting backstage first. Are you all well? So, what we're going to do today, we're going to have a little chat around the table about peated whiskey. I think it's something that all of you know something about from one angle or another. And yeah, I think what we should try to do today is come at the topic from lots of different angles, and hopefully we can give some enlightening information or even some of our own opinions to the topic for the people watching. So I suppose the topic of peated whiskey is kind of, although people know roughly what the upshot of that is, it's a smoky flavour of whiskey. Not an awful lot is known about it, kind of in terms of the process and implications of lots of different aspects of that on the resultant whiskey. So I think what we should do is go right back to the beginning and try to really, like I said before, lift the lid off that for people and show under the bonnet of what makes a peated whiskey. But how we do that, I think, is go right back to the beginning and just discuss what is peat. Now, it's pretty common knowledge that Islay is full of the stuff. So maybe, James, you could give us a little bit of a starter for 10 and what is peat?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I mean, you can probably tell from my accent, I didn't spend a lot of the time in the peat bogs myself. Cool. We had people to do that for us, So, eventually. Anyway, so Islay. Well, I do know. I mean, I spent a lot of time on Islay, and if you've been to Islay, you'll quickly sort of come to realise that most of the island is peat bog. Flat areas of land. Typically not very suitable for agriculture, most often quite wet. And, historically, pretty much everyone on Islay would have had their own peat bank where they cut their own peat, the fibrous mud-like substance that you can cut out of the ground. Just probably a foot below the surface, there's the usable peat. And that is, as I say, it's generated over many years, mainly made up on Islay anyway of decomposed mosses.
James, when you said everybody has their own peat bank, that's not because everybody there is having their own peat bank to run a little distillery with. They're using it for fuel in the home, right?
Yeah. So traditionally, everyone pretty much, or every household would rent a peat bank off a landowner, and I'm told you can still do that, and it costs you about £10 a year to rent your peat bank, and from that you can cut your peats in the spring. And we're just finishing the peat cutting season at the moment on Isla, and dried over the summer and then used in the winter.
I think as we're on this topic, and James is describing so beautifully there how peat is made up in the ground, I think what I'd like to do is actually share some content with you and share my screen to show you some content that I have from, well, I'll describe where it's from when it comes up. If we could share that, please. Oops. Excuse my incompetence here.
Sorry, more of that to follow.
Here we go. Here we are. Okay, I hope you can all see that. I've got a little bit of research that we did through a partner company when we were building the Lagg distillery, because something we're doing down in Lagg is trying to really understand the nuts and the bolts of the topic of peat itself and go farther into it than maybe has been before. So there's lots of research been done that we commissioned for the construction of the distillery, and here's some of it here. Now you see that this shows you the distribution of peat all over the world, and what we have is actually a distribution towards 95% of peat existing in the northern hemisphere, and then only 4.4 or just close to 5% in the southern hemisphere. So that it shows you it's a northern hemisphere thing, and actually of the northern hemisphere stuff, 60% of it is in Canada. So they're a very peat bog rich country. The UK, I think, is about 10% of the whole northern hemisphere distribution. Now, James described the makeup of peat. Here we have a little diagram. You can see here in a couple of areas, it's made up of 2 or 3 layers, really. We have the vegetation layer, so that's where the plants here below are actually growing. You have things like sphagnum moss, bog cotton, bog myrtle, these types of plants all grow on the surface. And then over time, as they decompose, they work their way into this acrothelm, as it's called. Now, here we have a uneven distribution of peat in the ground. You have the acrothelm, then you have the water table, where the plants will take their sustenance from, and then underneath the catothelm. So let's have a look at that in a real world situation. James, as you were describing, here we are, a peat cutting situation, and it's very clear. I think this looks like Harris or Lewis or something that, to me, in the landscape looks a bit Hebridean, like outer Hebridean. And what we've got is the acrothelm on the top, which you can see is far drier. There's far more obvious plant matter here. Then below you have the catothelm. Now, distillers want the more plant matter rich acrothelm, which exists on top. And you can see the very obvious water table mark there, the split between the 2 layers. Then below, the really dark catothelm, and that's thousands of years old. And this is where the peat would be cut for burning in the home for fuel. So this produces a lot less smoke in the catothelm. That burns with less smoke and more heat. And the acrothelm on top, the more light brown area, burns with far more smoky characteristic. I'll stop sharing now. So there's a bit of sorry, Andrew.
There's quite differences in the kind of microbiology in the different layers, as well as the composition of the peat itself. So below that water table level, you're going to have an anaerobic environment, and therefore the bacteria and the fungi that are down in that area are going to be producing compounds that aren't be things that we're necessarily going to want in a malting process. There'll be higher nitrogen content and higher sulfur producing compounds in there as well. So that would be pretty unpleasant stuff to be putting into your malt.
So where we take the peat from is going to determine what flavors we get in a smoky dram, and to that end, I suppose it makes sense that we consider carefully where the peat's being cut from. It's not like you can use any old chunk of peat and create flavors, but it's quite a selective process. So yeah, I think effectively you're just talking about it's very old decomposed plant matter, isn't it?
Yeah, is it about 1,000 years per meter roughly as a guide?
God,
you go down to 1,000 years.
My goodness. I did actually ask a tour guide at Lafroig once, is there any concern about running out of peat? And James, I don't know if you ever get that question.
We get it a lot. I mean, the the truth of it is that it takes a long time to generate 1 millimeter a year kind of thing. So a meter is 1,000 years. There's lots of it.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of it, but I suspect we're probably using it marginally quicker than it's being created. But the truth of the matter is that I don't think anyone's really looked into it. I don't know that for sure, but I certainly haven't been made aware of that. But to give you an idea, we malt 4-ton batches. So one batch of malt for us is 4 tons. To malt that, or to peat it to 15 ppm, which is our peating level for our own malt,
later.
We'll use about 20 kilograms, so a wheelbarrow and a half. You're not talking vast quantities. Over the year we might use 2 tons.
Yeah, that's a good idea of metrics involved in that. Quite interesting, because you don't ever really hear. You hear about measurements of smokiness or peatiness farther down the line, but you never really hear about how much goes into the process in the beginnings. So I think we're getting towards this point where we can see that in island communities and highland communities where maybe there's less heat source of other types, you have less trees and what have you around to burn for fuel. It's pretty common that peat would be burned to give you that. But also where we have these entrenched communities where they're using these heat sources for a long time, often these places are often whiskey producing regions too. So I guess it's been used in whiskey for a long time too. And I don't know, what are you guys' thoughts on the reasons why it's been used in Scotch? Is it just purely a geographical coincidence? The peat's there, so we use it, or is there something more to it? I mean, what's your thoughts, Scott? Going back historically, do you think there's been any change in that?
I think if you look at what we do now versus what we did hundreds of years ago, the reason for using peat is now fundamentally different. We use it now for flavour, whereas historically it was used purely out of necessity. As you mentioned, the Highlands and Islands, and I'm talking about that geographically rather than whiskey regions, so include Speyside and Islay into the Highlands and Islands. There's very little in the way of trees, and there's very little in the way of coal or until the 1960s, oil discovered. So if you go back to these parts of Scotland a long time ago, they were using peat not just for the barley drying process that we know it for today. As you mentioned, it was a heat source, it was a fuel source that we used to cook with. So it would have been used to heat the water for mashing in, it would have been used to heat the stills. I think as coal became more available, you started to see that being shipped to distilleries, but that was still only being used in the heat that wasn't being used to dry the barley, because it was still the cheapest source of fuel. And then you get the 1960s, and that's when North Sea oil really starts to come in and takes the price of all the fuel sources down. So the Highland mainland distilleries start to use coal and gas in their production more. You've also got commercial maltings at that time coming in, but Islay and the islands are still way out of the way of any transport, so it makes sense to continue to use peat. But I think if you look today, it's much more a case of we want it for flavour. I think today it's quite difficult to imagine a time when smoke was seen as an off note. But if you look at whiskey's 2 biggest boom periods, one of them follows the introduction of grain whiskey, which would be blended with that heavily smoky whiskey. And the second follows the advent of these commercial maltings and a move away from peated production by the Highland distilleries in the 60s. So it's only now in the last 20 or 30 years that distilleries that had moved away from smoke are actually moving back to them.
Yeah, it's quite funny that something that started out as purely incidental to the product and just part of the way it was made has become something that actually now semi-defines the category as that flavour of smoke. And it's now, for a lot of distilleries, it's essential that they have that flavour because that's their character. It's not just something, a means to an end in terms of how they make their stuff, Yeah, so we're kind of getting into the realms of, I guess, how how peat is used, because we're discussing how it's used to heat people's homes and still is today. I mean, nothing better than the smell of a peat fire on a nice cozy night. But I suppose we have to get into a little bit about how peat is used in the whiskey making process, because we're kind of skimming that subject, you know, talking about using it as a heat source to fire you know, heat source stills there back in the day. Nowadays, only used in the malting process. But speaking from an Arran point of view, we kind of look at the use of peat in a couple of different ways. I'm sure people know nowadays we have two distilleries on Arran. We have the Lagg distillery and we have Lagg distillery. And the way that we approach peated spirit at both of those places differs massively. And I know, Scott, your place, Tomatin, really approaches the production of peated spirit in what I think is a really interesting and cool way. Can you give us an insight?
Yeah. So we're at Tomatin Distillery, and anyone that's picked up a bottle of Tomatin whiskey will know that that is not a peated whiskey at all. But back in 2005, we decided to buy in a batch of peated barley that winter, and laid it down into a variety of casks. And we've done that every winter ever since. So we only use peated barley in the winter. And it's lightly peated, but I think an interesting thing to touch on is when you move away from malting in-house and you're working with a commercial maltings, what they do is they don't peat 20 ppm, then 50 ppm, then 100 ppm. What they'll do is they'll produce a heavily peated barley and then blend that in with unpeated barley. So something like Kubokken is taking around about 20 ppm barley, but we'll play about with that every year. We're very lucky with Kubokken that this whiskey exists to be experimental. So we don't necessarily need that level of consistency all the time, which allows us scope to play with different peat levels and things like that. Last year we played about with yeast a little bit, so we used some red wine yeast and some sake yeast with the peated barley, and so we're experimenting all the way. But what is at the core of it is we're still using the Tomatin distillery, and Tomatin is a light spirit, and we can't escape that because of the fact that we've got these great big stills with a boil ball in the neck, and everything is designed to create more reflux. So even when we start with heavier peated barleys, by the time you get through production, you're still left with this quite sweet spirit with just a subtle smoke in it. So perhaps different from what Kilchoman and Lagg are doing is the Kubokken spirit is all about that light introduction to peat. And then we take that into the post-production phase and go into maturation and kind of look at that in a little bit different. I think I'd be wrong in saying that any of the casks that we're using in and of themselves are radically different from what's available to the rest of the industry. But the way we approach that is by marrying casks together that have never been done before. So we're looking for flavor combinations from the oak and just have that subtle smoke kind of tying everything together. But yeah, it's all about just looking at it in a slightly different way. Gregor's actually raised a very good question there. We the cut in the still, we've played about with that with Kubokken as well. I think initially we were maybe back in 2005 a little bit disappointed about how light the influence of the smoke was. So we started looking at later cuts in distillation. And that's not had a massive impact. It has a little bit, but it's more on the mouthfeel than necessarily the smoke content.
Yeah, I think we should fill out that point slightly for anyone else who's watching who maybe doesn't know about why the question over spirit cuts might come up. So, Rubokken, is that an Adamson creation cocktail?
I created it. Gregor named it. We did a thing a couple of weeks ago, which was have a look at what's in your house and make a cocktail. You're not allowed to go to the shops, kind of a lockdown cocktail. And we had some rhubarb growing in the back garden, so I made a Kubokken sour with like a rhubarb syrup. And Gregor, within seconds of me posting that online, came back with Rubokken Sewer as the name for it. So yeah.
Aye, you're talking about distillation cut points here as a means of affecting, sort of flavours within the spirit. What, Andrew, could you shed some light on why that might affect how a spirit might turn out?
Yeah, because at every point within the spirit run, different chemicals of different volatilities and different weights are going to transfer across the still at different temperatures and different times. So in your foreshots, you're going to have almost no phenols coming across. The vast majority of the phenols are going to come towards the end of the middle cut. And depending on whether you decide to extend that middle cut or not, will drag out some of these heavier oily components. And that may be why you start to have more of a richer mouthfeel potentially as some of the heavier oils come across as well. So I think I'm right in saying that in Lagranza, when you're running peated spirit, the cutting points are longer. And if you look again amongst peated whiskies, some of those ones that we really think of as being really peated, there might not be huge differences in the malt spec, but in terms of the cutting points, the heavier oily ones tend to be cutting at much lower ABVs.
Yeah, at actually, I'll correct you, at Lagranza, we don't change the cut points of the distillation for the simple reason that when we were coming up with Macri Moor, which is our peated expression, we were coming up with Macri Moor at the beginning, what we wanted was a true reflection of a peated Arran. So we wanted every aspect of the production to be the same except the peated barley. So a lot of producers will take the view that, like you were discussing there, Scott, where when you intend to make peated whiskey, you want to accentuate some of those flavours, so you change the distillation parameters to allow you to manipulate that. At Arran, what we were doing was trying to create something that was truly just a peated version of our existing Macri Moor, to highlight the difference that just changing the barley could have. So we keep the... Oh, here's another question from Russell. Aren't those cut points usually somewhat higher than with the non-peated expressions? Russell, normally if a distiller is trying to create a very heavy peated whiskey, the cut point on the bottom end will get longer. So to give you an example of that, at Arran we cut to faints at 63.5% alcohol. So once the strength in the spirit reaches 63.5, anything after that we consider to be faints. Now, to think about a really very tarry, heavily peated whiskey, the first one that you would spring to mind would be Lafroig. Their cut to faints is 59%. So we are considering that faints, but Lafroig are wanting those characters, so they choose to continue with the middle cut and drag those over. What are the cut points at Kilchoman, James, with regard to the characters?
We cut at 65.5 off spirit. So yeah, I mean that's. We use a heavily peated malt for most of our whiskey, 50 ppm malt. That it plays a part in terms of the balance of flavors that we're trying to achieve in terms of how we set our cuts, as well as a lot of other aspects in the production. But also, as important as that was for a new distillery to have something that matured pretty quickly in a cask, that didn't have too many characters, that maybe needed more time in the barrel to mature out. So. Mm-hmm. The fact that we wanted to combine that heavy peat and lighter flavors was weighed against also wanting to fill whiskey into a barrel that would be ready at 4 or 5 years old.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's certainly something that peated whiskey really lends itself to being enjoyed relatively young. That's something that really, really works, and I don't know whether that is part of the reason that sort of smoky whiskey as a character, maybe stereotypically from places like Islay, has been so successful, is because of its ability to be enjoyed when it's slightly of a younger age.
I think that, yeah, undoubtedly, with the heavier peated stuff that we produce, it's certainly at a younger age that peat gives it a sort of weight, and you have a market for that kind of style of whiskey. Whereas you have something slightly more subtle. You still have a slight fainty element that comes through until it kind of pushes up towards the 8-10-year-old mark.
Yeah, it can be pretty assertive, and you're under no illusions as to what style of whiskey you're drinking when you taste a slightly younger Islay. It's amazing.
At the same time, with those higher cuts that we have, you don't have that real sort of earthy, maybe slightly off notes. You have a fresh floral sort of vibrancy to the whiskey, rather than maybe the big, heavy, salty iodine kind of thing that people associate with, slapping them in the face, being overwhelming.
I suppose we talk so much in Peat about ppm, and it's a very easy marker for people to understand ppm, but it's only really part of the story, isn't it? And how much of that ppm is translating from the barley to the spirit and then to the mature product, because we're going to have degradation of phenols in maturation, but equally in the distillation process itself, and also quite importantly in fermentation. So as we extend fermentation time, we'll see reduction in phenols as well. So all these things are going to impact on how much of that phenol character is translated into the final spirit. And I think that's one of the reasons I love peat so much, is that there's just any number of endless things to consider.
I think, the example there is the Lagavulin Kalila thing. They're using the same barley to the same peating spec, but you get a very different whiskey at the end of it. And I think for me as well, I mean, ppm is one of my gripes now, along with the regions as a whole, in that I don't believe it's an accurate indicator of what you're going to get in the bottle now. Because if you were to take, say for example, you were to take a 40 ppm Kuboken, that's going to be a much, much lighter peat delivery than a 40 ppm Kilchoman or Lagg would be, just by the way that we're running that through the distillery.
Yeah, it's possibly it's possibly the most misleading metric in the whole whiskey discussion, because there's so many things. I always think of whiskey production like a sliding scale. So in the malting process, you have sliding scales of manipulation in terms of drying process. In the mash, even in the mill, you have sliding scales of ratios. In the mash, you have sliding scales in terms of temperature and time and raking and not raking. Fermentation's the same. There are sliding scales everywhere, and even making an adjustment on one of them will totally affect the outcome of the spirit in the end. And peat's no different.
But even in terms of milling with peat, then because most of these phenolic compounds are held within the husk of the grain itself, depending on how you mill that grain will determine how much of that is available in the spirit as well. And I think I spoken last year to a number of folk who said, things like roller distance had to be adjusted because the 2018 grains were smaller and harder and drier. So these are things that you wouldn't necessarily consider as you're sipping away.
Yeah, fascinating. I think that's amazing. So I don't know, what should we talk about next, lads? I was going to maybe go through the process of how when we talk about peat use in the whiskey making process, where does it first come in? James, you've got everything on site, and I'm sure you know a thing or two about the kiln, do you?
We're on our second kiln, we still haven't got it right. So we for about 20% of our production, we're growing barley, malting it ourselves on site. And as part of that malting process, we're using the peat. We cut the peat that we're using to malt our own barley. We cut it ourselves. So that I don't want to go back too much, but most of the peat that is being used by commercial malting houses is commercially extracted peat, which is actually can be quite different. There's a huge amount of subtleties. You kind of touched on it with the layering and things, but there's a lot of subtleties to the peat and itself. And I guess so long as you don't get lost in the detail with that, so long as you have something consistent that you're happy with, you can kind of work with it. But we've recently switched to hand cutting our peat, and after we've soaked the barley, we've laid it on the floor, and the barley's germinated, still moist and sort of porous, if you like. That's transported up to the kiln floor, and we will burn peat straight away when it's up there for around about 9 or 10 hours for our malted barley, and that will give a peating level of about 15 to 20 ppm. And I say about because it really is about,
It's an approximation.
Yeah.
And Mariella is running the show in the background for us very kindly, because I am absolutely incapable of doing two things at once. But Mariella, there was a question there that you were going to bring up again. Could we see that, please? I thought it was a good. So Gregor again, will Lagg be communicating its peat levels as per Bruichladdich? If so, maybe elaborate on when the ppm is measured. Okay, so this is something that, again, part of the reason we were saying that ppm is perhaps one of the more misleading parts of measurement in Scotch whisky is that the understanding and I would say with a broad stroke that a lot of consumers would perceive ppm higher means more smoky. And I think that's, for reasons we've already discussed, can be misleading. So we have to be very careful if we do try to publicise that information, that we say when, or we discuss when it's been measured. Now, ppm, as Scott already said, is measured in the malting stage. Have any of you guys ever heard about distilleries, I don't know, measuring ppm in a bottled product?
Yeah. So, and Knock did a series of peated whiskies where they're measuring the ppm at bottling, if I'm right. And so that they're already taking out then any kind of mess that could happen between the distillation, the maturation. So it's the ppm of the liquid, and that's maybe a more accurate way to kind of present it. But equally, it's a difficult way to then benchmark, if you like, against other products. I think it's been a very interesting project that they've done, but I don't see the industry as a whole adopting it. But it's great to have that there as part of the discussion.
I think peating level and ppm, it's a similar thing to like age statement. Age means about as much to a bottle of whiskey as a ppm measure does. You play around with it, and there's all sorts of different aspects of the production that contribute to the peating level and also the sort of level of maturity, if you like.
I think that's a thing we're mentioning, Andrew, in that they've measured the peat of the bottled product, the ppm of the bottled product, but that is a chemical measurement, and that is not accurate in what you're going to get in the sensory side of things, because it doesn't account for if it's been in a sherry cask, which will have more dominant flavors than necessarily a bourbon cask. There would still be the same level of phenols in there because it's part of the liquid, but it might be that the other chemicals in the liquid are more flavor active.
But also, just to simplify peat flavor is just about ppm and phenol. It does a disjustice to peat. There's so much more to what peat can contribute as a flavor than just phenols.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what you're saying there, Andrew. Oh, there's another question from Gregor. Are there alternatives to peat that can still impart similar flavour chemical profiles? Now, if you were to throw another type of fuel on a peat fire while on a fire when you're drying your barley, the element of flavour, of smoky flavour from whatever you're burning will be absorbed into the barley. So I dare say, if you throw a rubber tire onto a malting fire, that some of those revolting flavours is what you would impart into your barley. So I don't think that there's dubiety about that. I think if you did want to manipulate that slightly, then you could use another fuel source.
Well, I think Balvenie recently just launched their one that was a part of the drying malt was they were burning heather.
Yeah,
and that's the first one I'm aware of where they've managed to do something else like that. And a lot of the Scandinavian distillers have got a bit more freedom to movement, and they've burned things like juniper and so on, which is quite cool. I was on a kind of call with Balvenie about this, and a few questions about how the SWA accepted the burning of the heather were kind of dodged. So I'm not sure how much they want to promote that sort of thing or not, but it sounds like a very interesting thing.
Yeah. And I suppose isn't peat just kind of decayed heather anyway? It just wasn't.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just very immature, non-age statement peat that they've used.
How much, there's another question, Shay Francis, how much impact does the area where the peat comes from have on the end product? Well, I think that one is a pretty easy answer, and it is really quite influential, because I suppose you have to think about what's been decaying as a plant matter to make up that peat. So an Islay, not a whole lot of trees in Islay, so it doesn't tend to be made up of woody material. It's more mosses and things which decompose over time. And conversely, up in Tom and Towel region, where most of our malting is done for Arran, if we choose to go with a peated spec, the peat comes from up in that neck of the woods, Scott, closer to you. So the plant matter up there is fundamentally different. So yes, the peat itself will be different, and hence the smoke. There's another one from Shade.
Yeah, he's touched on a pet subject of mine.
A couple of years ago, you looked into that, didn't you?
Yeah, a wee bit. Yeah, I think fundamentally, for me, it's a climate thing, and the climate is different on the west coast as it is on the east coast over here. But interestingly, there are more similarities between St Fergus peat in the very east of Scotland to Island peat as there is in Tomintoul peat. And even within a peat bog, there's going to be regional climatic differences, or differences depending on whether it's a blanket bog or a basin bog. But effectively, the plants that are growing there are going to be determined by that local climate. So that will impact what flavours are available. And the microbes that are living within that peat bog environment as well are going to be determined by the climate. So, whether it's coastal, whether it's high rainfall or whatever. And even at a more interesting level, looking at a lot of the peats in Islay, they're quite high in acetyl vanillins, vanillin compounds, and usually we associate vanillin compounds with American white oak. But there's fungi in these areas that are producing these vanillins, so we're getting extra flavour compounds. Again, it's a bit more than just the ppm, the phenols. But the kinds of phenols you're going to get are going to be determined by the plant matter that's there. So, like you say, your high sphagnum moss content is going to give you more simple phenols, whereas your woodier compounds, your heathers, your sedges, your grasses, anything with higher lignin content is going to give you more of your glycols and so on, stringols. These are going to give you different flavours altogether.
Touched on, you mentioned glycols there. That is another thing I think we should discuss, is that peat itself, when you talk about phenols and the smoky flavours which do impart into the barley during this process, phenols is not where it ends. Phenols are a family of compounds, and it's a big family. There are loads of them, and they all have different flavours. So the likes of glycol, which can give you a slightly medicinal taste. Then you have eugenol as well, another phenol which is slightly more spicy. Creosol, another phenol which gives you a smoky flavour. Then the list is endless, and when you think about the actual proportions that these are present in, is when it gets even more mind-blowing. Because in whiskey, what we call the flavour compounds are congeners. So these are the compounds in whiskey which give us the taste. Okay, so when we're talking about take for example the washback. So that is what we call the feedstock for the stills. Now in the washback, only 0.1% of the volume of that liquid is flavour compound. Only 0.1% of that is actually congener. When we step that into the still, that jumps up to 0.5%. Wow, imagine that. 0.5% of your middle cut distillate is congener. So it's tiny amount of flavour compound, and even less than that is phenol itself. It's remarkable how strongly these flavours come through, and it's not just phenol; it's a mix of many different types of chemical of phenol.
We're talking about micrograms per litre that's required for perception, and all these different phenols will have different perception levels. So different concentrations from about 62 micrograms per litre up to like 7,100 micrograms per litre, just to be able to perceive these flavours within the spirit itself.
Mm-hmm. And when you measure that, it's not always the ones which have the highest micrograms per litre which are the most strong tasting. It's quite remarkable.
Plus, we want to balance these different flavours. If you have just simple phenols, it's not going to be very pleasant. It's going to be quite ashy, astringent. If you've got a mixture of all these different flavour compounds, that's where you're going to get a better balance, a bit more robust depth of flavour. But by nature of it being a natural product anyway, there are mixtures of these chemicals within it anyway. So.
Amazing. James, I've got a question for you.
I hope it's not too sciencey. I mean,
it's a taste related question. So I suppose you've been following casks of Kilchoman which have been maturing from, how old are you now? 13, 15? How old's the distillery?
I thought you were talking about me. The distillery is 15 years old this year.
Years old, right. So, do you notice a perceptible difference in the smokiness of a 15-year-old Kilchoman to, say, a 3 or 4-year-old's expression?
Yeah, I mean, cast type plays a part. You know, whether it's a fresh cast or not, but all the other things being equal, you know, the 14, 15-year-old cask is significantly less peaty than the younger stuff. I find with Kilchoman actually, after about 18 months, 2 years, the peat is at its sort of almost at its peak in terms of the influence on the whiskey, and then from there it kind of tends to taper away a bit. I'm talking about Kilchoman anyway. And,
yeah, interesting the way the flavours develop, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you see it often when you try maybe a really old expression of something from Islay. Sometimes the peat is almost maybe not even perceivable, even though the spirit itself would have been there and really, really smoky in its infancy. But the really old expressions, even though technically it's still a heavily peated whiskey, it's maybe not quite so obvious. And it kind of changes the way that you appreciate those whiskies. It turns more into maybe even more like a seasoning rather than a main flavour, if you know what I mean. Kind of starts to underpin it. And I think that as whiskies age, it's not necessarily that phenols disappear, it's that other flavour compounds get larger.
Yeah, especially when you start to bring things like oxidization into it as well, where it's not just the spirit and the cask interaction, you've got the environment playing a role as well. And I think another thing that's interesting, and this is perhaps the way things used to be done rather than an example of old bottle effect, but when you try some of these old Lafroigs from the 60s and things like that, the level of smoky aromas and phenolic aromas from those whiskies is far more subdued than it is if you were to compare a 10-year-old from 50 years ago to a 10-year-old today. It's a totally different thing. Now, whether that's because the level of peat used has differed or if it's just old bottle effect, it's hard to really know, but it's not just happening with maturation, it's in the bottle as well.
But possibly yeast variants as well and differences in fermentation technique, I think could have an impact as well. There's just so many factors, you know, it's going to be difficult to nail it to nail it down to one. So I keep bringing it back to geek. I can't help it, man.
Trying to pin down a whiskey, so this whiskey tastes this way because of this, you just can never say that.
No.
I think that's part of what makes the discussion about whiskey in general just so endlessly fascinating, because there's so many different things that can change to influence the flavour.
Yeah, we're scratching the surface on one topic, you know.
Yeah,
and it's just I think it's an interesting topic because it's one of those ways to really draw a line down the middle of whiskies, isn't there? It's one of those divisive ones. You know, there's the smoky whiskies, the non-smoky whiskies. And it can be something that people like or don't like, but so often that is what determines whether a person's going to like a whiskey or not like it before they start to talk about cask types or techniques or anything like that. Time,
even age.
Yeah, yep. Even that.
Yeah, Florian there asked, "What do I have in my glass? It's an amazing colour." That is a whiskey that we're producing only for the Lagg distillery at the moment. It's a distillery exclusive. It's Macri Moor finished in a sherry cask. So it's a really nice dark colour, Oloroso sherry. So you get that lovely Oloroso type character, there, dried fruits, and that really nice structure and sort of slightly dusty flavour. But then you have the really nice peaty punch underneath, and that's actually Lochranza peated spirit. And I should maybe touch on what we do at Lagg in terms of our peated production, because I told you roughly about what we do up at Lochranza, and that when we run, not that we do it anymore, actually peated production has now ceased at Lochranza, but when we were still doing that, the idea was to make a peated version of the Arran dram, so all we would do is change the barley and nothing else. But when we came to start Lagg, you know, we did start that distillery with a vision in mind, and part of it is because of this discussion about peat. It's so massive, and to be honest with you, nobody's having it. So that's one of our ideas, is to really make that discussion a whole lot bigger, and literally to dig a bit deeper into the topic. So up at Lochranza, we're trying to make a very clean and sweet peated expression where the smoke isn't all over the nose and everything. Down at Lagg, it's very, very different. So the production methodology at Lagg it does differ slightly. For a start, the mash tun is doubly big. And what we do down at Lagg is we rake the mash. So once the barley comes in with the water, we actually rake the bed quite aggressively, and that means that the wort which emerges is cloudy and not clear. Now that has implications on the fermentation. And then also we're doing a very long fermentation down at Lagg. So we are using a 50 ppm malt, but as Andrew said, the longer you go, the more you may sort of curtail the perceived smokiness. So we're trying to measure up a balance there of extra flavour development, but also keeping the body about the smoky element of it. Also down at Lagg, the spirits, the stills are massive, and they're almost the wash still is almost formless. It's just a big lump of copper, and we're trying to really cut down on reflux there, and we're trying to make sure that we don't get too much of that. The line arms are also very sharply angled downwards, again to discourage reflux. So reflux would be when vapor from the inside hits the inside of the still, then falls back down. If we have a very wide still, we minimize that. And the spirit run, again, coincidentally, actually, the bottom cut is 63% alcohol, but we do run the stills a whole lot faster at Lagg, almost 10 litres a minute in the spirit cut, whereas at Lochranza it's very slow, 6 litres a minute. So do you change any of that, Scott, when you're on Kubokin on the distillation side of things? Because I heard that your colleague Krish explain it in a really cool way as to the mindset around making Kubokin, in that in the winter the Tomatin distillery closes and the Kubokin distillery opens.
Yeah, that's very much it. It's two distilleries within one at that point. It's very much that everything that we do to create Tomatin, just that rule book gets thrown out, and we bring a new one in for a couple of weeks, and it's Kubokin distillery for a couple of weeks. So yeah, not so much of a huge difference on the mashing side of things, but fermentation, there's a slightly shorter fermentation because of almost the opposite of what you were saying. We lose a lot through distillation, so we try and retain quite a lot in the mashing side. Whereas at Tomatin, our mash, we've actually got two fermentation lengths. We've got a short, which is 53 hours, and a long, which is 103 hours. But for Kubokin, we're leaning more to that shorter side. And then on the distillation, it's less about the differences in speed. We're not particularly more aggressive with the Kubokin production, but it's more about taking that later cut in the run, as we touched on earlier on. So you do get a spirit that, even if you were to use unpeated barley, is noticeably different from what you would produce in a normal week of producing Tomatin. And that's kind of what we're trying to get across with this liquid as well, is it's not a peated Tomatin. It is something altogether quite different.
Yeah, I have tasted a number of the Kubokin expressions through hanging out on the road over the years, and yeah, they are really fascinating expressions.
Just to pick up on the point you made there about your stills, I was fortunate enough to be doing a wee tour of Forsyth's coppersmiths while they were just about to dispatch the stills to Lagg, and there was, with a little bit of understanding of what different shapes and sizes of a still will do, there was no mistaking what you were going to try and get out of that still down at Lagg. Like you say, it was that almost formless shape of just smoke production.
Totally, yeah. And having said that, the spirit still down at Lagg does have a reflux ball, so that allows us in future to create a lighter expression should we wish to. But the still speed that we're using down there actually, to some extent, passes that. So this is still allows flexibility in the future, but generally, yeah, you're right. It's totally all around making the heavier spirit. Now we've got a couple of questions coming in here. There's one from Russell. Does running the stills at that much faster lead to many more heavy oils and phenolic congeners going over the line arm? I would have to say yes to that, because there's less reflux going on in the still, so you're encouraging more of the you're encouraging less redistillation, which translates to heavier characters. And in terms of the phenolic element, those exist at the end of the distillation run, hence our discussion around late cut points. So yeah, the later you cut and the faster you run your still, the the more heavy congeners you'll carry over. Although you have to be very wary that you don't run too fast and end up with any carryover or entrainment, because that's the worst possible outcome.
Don't want that.
Yeah.
Did you play about with running the distillery to an extent before deciding on how you would create the Lagg spirit?
Yeah, that was quite interesting actually. Just to sort of late winter, early spring of, I guess it must have been 2019. Was that last year? Yeah, early. Yeah, of course, the time moves so fast. But myself and Lucy went over to the island, and we were present on day one of distillation at Lagg, purely in a commissioning phase, and so we weren't producing for filling at that point. It was a commissioning phase of the distillery to try to nail down as best we could what the parameters were going to be, and we did absolutely play about with the settings, because with the best will in the world, you know yourself, when you construct a new distillery and when you specify still shape and everything, you can do it with a vision or an idea in mind of what you're trying to create, but until you turn it on for the first time, you haven't got the foggiest idea what's going to come out. So you have to be willing and ready to change parameters and heats and speeds. And yeah, we did all that on day one. And I remember being there as we decided to run the still faster or slower, and really watching the difference in that. And it is a big contributor. On the first run at Lagg, you run number one. I remember tasting a sample of the spirit off the still, and smoky level was really low. The smoke element of it wasn't so present, so we had to really tweak the settings to increase that, which is where we are now.
I can imagine you loving that, Andy.
I was beside myself. Like,
yeah, a good day.
Yeah, you don't get these opportunities a hell of a lot.
I know.
Yeah, James, are your parameters up at Kilhoman absolutely set in stone, or do you ever change any of it?
They're pretty much set, to be honest. We work with Jim Swan for the we have two sets of stills effectively. We have kind of two sides of the still house. So our stills are particularly small spirit stills, just over 2,000 liters, wash still just over 3,000 liters. Very small stills. And so when we came to increase our production, we've recently put in some new stills as a sort of almost like a separate distillery, because it's the only thing that they share is the boiler. Everything else, ash tuns, washbacks, the whole lot, all had to be new. And we pretty much put it on, plugged it in, turned it on, and we were pretty happy. So,
job done.
Job.
The cooling issues, away we went. Yeah.
Great.
But I mean, the first time around when we first kind of put in the first set of stills at Kilhoman, you have issues, but a lot of it's mechanical. A lot of it's just temperatures aren't doing what you thought they'd do when you pump the boiler up this much, and the boiler's not, it's got choked by peated water or water treatment. A lot of it's, running a distillery is obviously about producing the whiskey, but there's a whole lot of mechanics that go into it which are not associated with kind of the spirit itself. So more often than not, that's where the complications come, because the stills are pretty simple. Heat on, heat off. It
doesn't collapse every now and again. That's fine.
Yeah. But simplifying it. Whereas you put me in front of our boiler, I wouldn't have a fucking sorry. I wouldn't have a clue what to do.
Yeah, it seems to be said for the kiln.
Yeah. The second kiln is because going back a bit, we have used coal in our peating as well, and that produced quite a different. Well, we didn't use it in our peating. We peated and then we dried using coal until we had a spark go up the kiln and burn it down. So that put an end to that.
Wow. That's actually a good point to mention. Not drying, but peating, because the two are not the same thing. When you're peating barley, the peat is not put onto the fire as a heat source. That's not the point. The peat, when it's put on, shouldn't catch fire. It should be smouldering enough to release the smoke. Actually, you have to be very careful with malting and drying in particular, because that is the point where you need to preserve as much enzyme content as possible. Also, the phenolics which are existing in the smoke, if you go too high temperature, you'll destroy them. So actually what you need to do is maintain a relatively cool temperature when you're smoking the barley, and that allows the smoke to be thick and full of flavour, and it also allows the barley to absorb it properly. There's another question. Is the spirit coming out from the new distillery at Kilchoman any different from the liquid from the original stills? I would hope the answer to that would be no, but I don't know. What's the answer, James?
I mean, essentially no. You know, there is a very, very slight difference, but that could be, we haven't nailed it down exactly why, and we're not particularly bothered. So yeah, I mean, there is a very, very slight difference, but if you'd have to really, really search for it, and that's mainly down to the heat. We've got radiators in the new stills, so whereas we have coils in the old stills.
Slightly different internal makeup. There's a question there from Jack Toy, loyal white stag. I see, there we are. So any specific wine cask we'll be working with, or we think will work well with the Lagg spirit? Jack, I think we would have to see what the Lagg whiskey turns out like before we start looking at wine casks. It's very difficult to say from a new spirit or a one-year-old spirit destined to be whiskey what wine casks will work well. I think we have to get our heads around what character we're looking at as a house style of whiskey before we start manipulating that with a wine cask. So I wouldn't like to say at this stage, although I will tell you at this point we are kind of working towards what a Lagg range will look like. So that's something to take away. But we are filling primarily or only bourbon casks at the moment, but there are plans afoot to expand on that. But the experimentation at Lagg really isn't necessarily all about casks the same way as it is at Lochranza. So we're well known at Lochranza for changing cask types, and maybe a wine finish here or there is quite good fun and makes a nice whiskey. But down at Lagg, the opportunity we have really is to experiment with the production side of things. So this is a blank canvas. We can change fermentation times, we can change yeast strain, we can change cut points. The big plan is to change peat sources every so often. You know, let's take this to the nth degree and really look at the influence of peat properly. And I'll say it here so that you've heard it first and there's a record of it. But let's go right down to the minutiae and talk about single cask, single bog. You know, we could really go right down to the micro ecosystem of any one peat bog, and you know, hugely interesting topic.
I mean, I was when I heard about Lagg coming online and these things, I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. When you and Mitchell described it to me as like a peat laboratory, I was like, that's it, I'm sold. Sign me up.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Are you doing anything in terms of different barley varieties, or are you sticking with the main distillers barley for the time being and then just focusing on the peat side?
Well, to begin with, we are using the commercially malted barley that the majority of us use. However, as we have been doing at Lochranza for the past 4 or 5 years, we will malt and distill a proportion of local barley every year. So it's quite cool when you think of Lagg as an area. Lagg's a village on Arran, so when you think of that as an area, that's actually where illicit distillation used to happen in profusion mostly, because it's the most farmable land. That's where all the barley was. And what we'll see then when we distill local barley for the first time is a real true South End Arran whiskey being produced as it would have been back in the old days for the first time in probably close to 200 years. So once we get our hands on some Arran peat, which is absolutely in the plan, some Arran barley, we combine the two, we're going to have a 100% local product, which the good folks at Kilchoman have been producing for many years, and it's no novelty to them. But on Arran, this is something that's going to be groundbreaking. So yeah, really interesting times to come on the barley front too. And yeah, it would be great to experiment with varieties.
Just need a few Atlantic Oak Arran casks as well.
Will Lagg use different American oak casks for different lengths of maturation? First fill for short-term maturation, second fill for longer term. Well, Russell, I don't know how you guys feel, but my take on wood policy is that it's not just fill first fill casks. wood policy is the creative use of refills, even third fills sometime, depending on what you're going to do. So the answer to that, simple, yes, of course, we will fill first and refill casks for different purposes. I'm sure the same is true at all of you guys' distilleries, Scott, James.
Yeah, we mostly buy first fills and then refill. So we're not buying any refills, but we are using those that we have.
But those refills, they have a very definite place in your plan in terms of maturation program. So you are working refills in.
Yeah, the only time that will maybe change is if the cask that we've used for a first fill is a particularly old piece of wood that's been soaked in wine for years and years and years. And then after that first fill, there's nothing in terms of either previous contents or oak extractives left to take in. And even then we would use it, but probably for holding liquid that would become a blend. So we would fill some grain whiskey into that or something like that.
Yeah. Well, if you are, like Andrew has done, come on board with the Lagg journey, if you are interested in coming on that with us, there is the opportunity to purchase a Lagg first fill cask. We're only selling 700 of these. We're making very good headway into that 700 cask allocation. And once they're sold out, we won't sell any more for 10 years. So there's an opportunity to come on this journey in Peat with us and to have your own piece of the Lagg distillery heritage from the early days, which is quite an exciting opportunity. You did that, didn't you, Andrew? You came on board and became a Lagg Cask Society member. Yep.
I've actually got fingers in a few pies there as well. So just quite a few groups of us have joined together to get some, and then our family bought a cask as well. So it'll be good to compare how the spirit has behaved in the different casks. Looking forward to that, but just good to feel part of something new. I was a wee boy when Lagg distillery was built, so it's nice to be part of something from the beginning.
Yeah, that's something that I think people really enjoyed with Lagg. So we were keen to let people make that journey again if they wanted to, and it's certainly been pretty popular so far. Anyway,
if you're down at Lagg Distillery and you see a cask with Andrew Smith on the side of it, that's the one that you get to dip into and have a free dram from.
Yeah. The sampler.
Yeah, don't bother.
There's another question, Danny. How much can you tell about the direction a cask will take? How much can you tell about the direction a cask will take the spirit from the new make spirit? Danny, it's educated guesswork. I'm afraid that's the best answer to that. You know the reliability of a cask supplier. You can, as best you can, specify where the casks come from. You could purchase from a single bourbon house. I think, James, all yours come from Buffalo Trace. Is that right?
Yeah.
So over time, you get to know, you get a feeling of what type of whiskey any one type of cask will produce. But for somebody to roll a cask in off a lorry and say, what kind of whiskey will that make? You'd have to be Nostradamus to know. It is simply a thing.
So speaking specifically about peat in this instance, char level of a cask is going to have an effect on phenolic retention. So a heavier char will reduce phenols faster. Because so much about casks and what we discuss in maturation is about additive maturation and extraction from the cask.
Yeah.
But there's also reductive maturation to consider as well. So,
yeah. And then I think to the point you were making there, Andy, even with the best knowledge of a supplier, I would imagine that casks that maybe work fantastically well up at Lagg might have a totally different impact down at Lagg, or take it in a different direction from what you maybe were looking for. So it's all about spirit and wood rather than just knowing one or the other.
Yeah, I think with Lagg, we're using the experience of James McTaggart and Graham Ormond, who's our distillery manager down there, to know, I suppose, the spirit combined with the cask supply that we have in place to produce something that will be of reliable quality. Just exactly what direction that will be, this is part of the journey we're on too. I mean, you don't know precisely. It's the same way as before you turn the distillery equipment on day one, you don't exactly know what type of spirit you're going to get from that. The same is true of wood policy. When you start filling your casks, you're doing it with like I said, their educated guesswork and knowing what casks are good casks, but without knowing exactly what will come out, and that is genuinely part of the journey. And James, I guess at Kilchoman, you've been finding your house style over the past 10 years or so, but for the first 0 to 5 years, you don't really know what sort of whiskey you're going to be.
Yeah, I think, you can tell maybe at what point you can compare maybe a Lagg new make with a Kilchoman new make, and you can say, oh, okay, well, Kilchoman in a bourbon barrel, kind of a fresh bourbon is about right at this level or at this age, and then you can make a determination against the different style and how long it might take to kind of reach a balance. But as you say, it really comes down to trying it out, seeing how it works, and kind of adjusting from there.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Well, guys, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's certainly been enlightening for me hearing all your different angles on the topic. It's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Anytime, Andy.
Well, I suppose I'll let you go, and I can see some sun streaming in the window behind you there, James. I don't think you've run out yet down there. I think there's some left here too. So we'll say adieu and go and enjoy our evenings. I hope everybody watching has enjoyed that. Slán Cheers, lads.